In the 1960s, church women knew how to make potluck dishes that mattered. Their work wasn't just cooking. It fed families after Sunday services and at funerals. These 30 forgotten recipes might sound too old today, but they kept congregations fed. Let's rediscover what nobody serves anymore. Green bean casserole was the backbone of every 1960s church potluck. It appeared at Sunday dinners, holiday meals, and weeknight suppers in the fellowship hall. The recipe was simple: canned green beans drained and mixed with cream of mushroom soup, topped with canned fried onions, and baked in a casserole dish until bubbling. The beans were soft. The soup was salty and thick, and the onions stayed crisp on top even after sitting under foil for an hour. It was cheap, under $2 to make a dish that fed 12, and it could sit on a warming table without losing much. Women brought it in Pyrex dishes covered with aluminum foil, and it was always one of the first to empty. Green bean casserole disappeared from church potlucks when fresh vegetables became the standard and cream of mushroom soup fell out of favor. The casserole felt too processed, too canned, too 1960s. But if green bean casserole felt too plain, what came next was sweeter, stranger, and made entirely from gelatin. Jello salad wasn't dessert. It was a side dish, served cold in a glass bowl and passed around the fellowship hall like it belonged next to the fried chicken. The base was orange or lime jello mixed with shredded carrots, crushed pineapple, and sometimes mini marshmallows or cottage cheese. It was set in the refrigerator overnight, then unmolded onto a plate or scooped into individual servings. The texture was strange, slippery, sweet, with crunchy bits of carrot suspended in the gelatin. It cost under $1 to make and could feed 20 people. It was bright, colorful, and looked impressive on a potluck table. Jello salad disappeared when gelatin stopped being considered a legitimate salad base, and younger generations refused to eat anything that wiggled. The carrot-pineapple combination felt outdated, and the cottage cheese version was deemed inedible by modern standards. But if Jello salad felt too sweet, what came next was savory, rich, and covered in paprika. Deviled eggs were mandatory at every 1960s church potluck. They were brought on special egg plates with divided sections covered with plastic wrap and placed near the front of the serving line. The preparation was simple: hard-boiled eggs, halved, yolks mashed with mayonnaise, mustard, salt, and a pinch of sugar, then piped or spooned back into the whites and dusted with paprika. The eggs were creamy, tangy, and disappeared within minutes. Women made dozens at a time because a single batch never lasted. They cost pennies to prepare. Eggs were cheap, and mayo and mustard were pantry staples. Deviled eggs faded from church potlucks when food safety concerns grew and people worried about mayonnaise sitting out too long. Younger cooks found them too labor-intensive, and the paprika-dusted presentation felt old-fashioned. But if deviled eggs felt too delicate, what came next was heartier, cheesier, and topped with crushed potato chips. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Tuna noodle casserole was the ultimate church supper dish, cheap, filling, and easy to transport. The recipe mixed canned tuna, cooked egg noodles, cream of mushroom soup, frozen peas, and a can of condensed milk, then topped the whole thing with crushed potato chips before baking. The result was creamy, salty, and crunchy on top, with soft noodles and chunks of tuna throughout. It cost under $3 to make a dish that fed 15 people, and it reheated well in the church kitchen. Women brought it in rectangular baking dishes covered with foil, and it was always present at Wednesday night suppers and funeral luncheons. Tuna noodle casserole disappeared when fresh fish became affordable and canned tuna's reputation declined. The potato chip topping felt too processed, and younger generations preferred pasta dishes without cream soup. But if tuna casserole felt too heavy, what came next was lighter, sweeter, and filled with marshmallows. Ambrosia salad was the sweet side dish that showed up at every church potluck in the 1960s. It was made with canned mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, shredded coconut, sour cream or whipped cream, and mini marshmallows, all mixed together and chilled in a glass bowl. The texture was creamy, chewy, and cold, with bursts of citrus sweetness from the fruit. It was inexpensive, under $2 for a large bowl, and could be made the night before. Ambrosia salad was served alongside fried chicken, casseroles, and jello molds, and children always went back for seconds. It disappeared from church potlucks when fruit salads became healthier and whipped cream and marshmallows were deemed too sugary. The canned fruit and coconut combo felt outdated, and the name itself, ambrosia, became a punchline for retro church food. The first 5 dishes were church potluck staples: green beans, jello, deviled eggs, tuna casserole, and ambrosia. But the next 5 go deeper. Fried chicken brought in plastic containers, funeral potatoes that fed 100, pimento cheese sandwiches no one makes anymore, macaroni salad with Miracle Whip, and sheet cake that disappeared in minutes. Fried chicken was the crown jewel of every 1960s church potluck. It was made at home the night before or early Sunday morning, fried in a cast-iron skillet with lard or Crisco, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes paprika, then packed into Tupperware containers or foil-lined baskets. The chicken arrived at church still warm, with a crispy, golden crust and juicy meat inside. It was expensive compared to casseroles. A whole chicken cost around $1 in the 1960s, but it was worth it because fried chicken always disappeared first. Women brought drumsticks, thighs, and breasts, and the pieces were gone before the blessing was finished. Fried chicken faded from church potlucks when deep fryers replaced skillets and grocery store rotisserie chickens became cheaper. Funeral potatoes earned their name because they showed up at every church funeral luncheon in the 1960s. The dish was made with frozen hash browns, cream of chicken soup, sour cream, shredded cheddar cheese, and butter, topped with crushed cornflakes and baked until golden and bubbling. It was rich, salty, and filling, comfort food in a casserole dish. It cost around $3 to make and could feed 20 people easily. Funeral potatoes were heavy enough to be a main dish and traveled well in foil pans. They were served at potlucks, church suppers, and any gathering where people needed something warm and dependable. The dish disappeared from regular rotation when lighter, less creamy potato dishes became preferred, and the name funeral potatoes felt too morbid for younger church members. Pimento cheese sandwiches were a church potluck staple throughout the 1960s South. The filling was made with shredded sharp cheddar cheese, mayonnaise, and chopped pimentos, spread thick on soft white bread, then cut into triangles or rectangles and arranged on a platter. The sandwiches were cold, creamy, tangy, and disappeared quickly at potlucks because they were easy to eat and didn't require a plate. A batch cost under $2 and made enough sandwiches to feed 30 people. Macaroni salad was a church potluck essential, brought in plastic bowls and served cold alongside fried chicken and casseroles. The recipe was simple: cooked elbow macaroni mixed with Miracle Whip, sweet pickle relish, diced onion, celery, and hard-boiled eggs, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar. The salad was creamy, tangy, and slightly sweet, with a texture that was soft and cool. It cost under $2 to make a large bowl and could feed 20 people. Macaroni salad was made the night before, so the flavors could meld, and it held up well on a buffet table for hours. It disappeared from church potlucks when mayonnaise replaced Miracle Whip, and younger cooks preferred pasta salads with vinaigrettes. Texas sheetcake was the dessert that ended every 1960s church potluck. It was baked in a large sheet pan, making it easy to transport and serve to a crowd. The cake itself was simple: flour, sugar, eggs, buttermilk, and cocoa powder, baked thin and topped with a hot chocolate icing made with butter, cocoa, and powdered sugar poured over the cake while both were still warm. The result was moist, rich, and intensely chocolatey. It cost under $2 to make and could feed 30 people. The cake was cut into squares and served directly from the pan, and it was always one of the last dishes to leave the fellowship hall. Texas sheet cake faded when layer cakes and cupcakes became more popular and sheet cakes felt too plain. The buttermilk and hot icing technique was replaced by boxed mixes and store-bought frosting. But if sheet cake felt too simple, what came next was meatier, sweeter, and baked with pineapple rings. The first 10 dishes were church potluck essentials: green beans, jello, deviled eggs, tuna casserole, fried chicken, funeral potatoes, pimento cheese, macaroni salad, and sheet cake. But the next 10 go deeper: ham and pineapple bakes, 7-layer salads, sloppy joes in slow cookers, corn pudding, and chicken a la king over biscuits. Ham and pineapple bake was a Sunday potluck favorite throughout the 1960s, especially around Easter and Christmas. The dish was built in a casserole pan. Slices of canned ham layered with pineapple rings, topped with a brown sugar glaze made from brown sugar, butter, and pineapple juice, then baked until the glaze caramelized and the ham turned golden. The result was sweet, salty, sticky, and rich, a main dish that tasted like dessert. It was affordable. A canned ham cost around $2 in the 1960s, and a can of pineapple rings added 50 cents, and it could feed 15 people. Women brought it in rectangular baking dishes covered with foil, and it was one of the first dishes to empty at church suppers. The pineapple rings stayed on top of the ham slices, soaking up the glaze, and the whole dish could be served warm or at room temperature without losing flavor. Ham and pineapple bake disappeared from church potlucks in the 1980s and 1990s when canned ham fell out of favor and the sweet-savory combination felt outdated. Younger generations preferred spiral-cut honey hams or baked chicken, and the brown sugar glaze seemed too heavy and too sugary. The pineapple rings, once a symbol of elegance and tropical sophistication, became a punchline for retro church food. The dish was remembered fondly by those who grew up eating it, but no one brought it to potlucks anymore. But if ham and pineapple felt too sweet, what came next was layered, colorful, and topped with bacon and peas. 7-layer salad was a showstopper at 1960s church potlucks, brought in a clear glass bowl so everyone could see the distinct layers stacked like a rainbow. The recipe was simple but precise: iceberg lettuce chopped and layered at the bottom, followed by layers of diced celery, chopped hard-boiled eggs, frozen peas, thawed but not cooked, shredded cheddar cheese, crumbled bacon, and finally a thick layer of mayonnaise spread across the top and sealed to the edges. The salad was made the night before, so the mayonnaise could seal the layers and keep everything fresh. It was inexpensive, under $3 for a large bowl that fed 20 people, and it looked impressive on a buffet table. The layers stayed distinct until the first scoop, and then the colors mixed into a creamy, crunchy, salty mess. The bacon added smokiness, the peas added sweetness, and the mayonnaise held everything together. It was served cold, often alongside fried chicken or ham, and children loved it because it tasted like a creamy, bacony salad bar. Seven-layer salad disappeared from church potlucks when iceberg lettuce lost its status and mayonnaise-based dressings fell out of favor. Younger generations found the idea of a mayonnaise seal unappealing, and the frozen peas felt too processed. The dish became a symbol of 1960s excess. Too much mayo, too much cheese, too much bacon. It was replaced by lighter, vinaigrette-based salads with mixed greens and fresh vegetables. But if seven-layer salad felt too rich, what came next was messier, sweeter, and served in a slow cooker. Sloppy Joes were a church potluck staple for Wednesday night suppers and youth group gatherings throughout the 1960s. The dish was simple: ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and a little vinegar, then simmered until thick and served on soft hamburger buns. The meat was sweet, tangy, and messy, hence the name, and it was always served in a slow cooker to keep it warm throughout the evening. It was cheap. A pound of ground beef cost around 50 cents in the 1960s, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples, and it could feed 30 people if the buns were small. Women brought the meat mixture in large pots or slow cookers, and a separate basket of buns sat beside it. Everyone made their own sandwich, piling the meat high and letting the sauce drip onto paper plates. Sloppy Joes were easy to eat, required no utensils, and were popular with children and teenagers. The dish faded from church potlucks when ground beef became more expensive and healthier. Leaner proteins replaced the greasy, ketchup-heavy sauce. Younger generations preferred tacos, sliders, or barbecue pulled pork, and the name Sloppy Joes felt too childish for adult gatherings. The slow cooker presentation, once practical and warm, became associated with basement church suppers and outdated fellowship meals. The recipe survived in school cafeterias longer than it did in churches. But if Sloppy Joes felt too messy, what came next was sweeter, softer, and baked in a casserole dish. Corn pudding was a Southern church potluck essential, brought in Pyrex dishes and served warm alongside fried chicken and green beans. The recipe was simple: canned cream-style corn mixed with whole kernel corn, eggs, sugar, butter, and a little flour or cornmeal, then baked until the top turned golden and the center set into a custard-like consistency. The result was sweet, creamy, and soft, somewhere between a side dish and a dessert. It was inexpensive, under $2 to make a dish that fed 15 people, and it held up well on a warming table. Corn pudding was made the morning of the potluck and reheated in the church kitchen, and it was especially popular in the fall and winter when corn was a symbol of harvest and Thanksgiving. The dish was rich enough to feel indulgent, but plain enough to serve alongside savory mains. Corn pudding disappeared from church potlucks when fresh corn became the standard, and canned cream-style corn fell out of favor. Younger generations found the texture too soft and the sweetness too pronounced, and the dish was replaced by roasted corn salads and grilled corn on the cob. The casserole presentation, once practical and warm, felt outdated, and the name corn pudding suggested something too old-fashioned for modern tastes. The recipe survived in Southern cookbooks, but rarely appeared at church suppers after the 1980s. But if corn pudding felt too sweet, what came next was richer, creamier, and served over biscuits. Chicken a la king was a 1960s church potluck dish that signaled elegance and effort. The recipe was labor-intensive: cooked chicken diced into small pieces, simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then mixed with pimentos, mushrooms, and sometimes peas or carrots. The sauce was thick, creamy, and pale, and it was served over split biscuits or toast points at church suppers and ladies' luncheons. It was more expensive than most potluck dishes, around $4 to make a large batch that served 20, but it was worth it because chicken a la king was considered refined and sophisticated. The dish felt too fancy, too labor-intensive, and too old-fashioned for casual church suppers. The name itself. The recipe survived in vintage cookbooks, but was rarely made after the 1970s. But if chicken a la king felt too fancy, what came next was stranger, wobblier, and molded into a ring. The first 15 dishes were church potluck staples: casseroles, salads, sloppy joes, and chicken a la king. But the next 5 go deeper: tomato aspic molded into rings, cheese balls rolled in pecans, hot chicken salad casseroles, pickled beet eggs, and pigs in a blanket. These weren't just old, they were controversial. Tomato aspic was the most controversial dish at any 1960s church potluck. It was a savory gelatin salad made from tomato juice, unflavored gelatin, lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, and sometimes finely diced celery or onion poured into a ring mold and chilled overnight until firm. The aspic was unmolded onto a platter, often with a center filled with cottage cheese or mayonnaise-based dressing, and served cold alongside fried chicken and casseroles. It was inexpensive, under $2 to make a large ring that served 20, but it was divisive. Some people loved the tangy, savory flavor and the way the gelatin wobbled on the plate. Others refused to touch it, calling it the tomato jello thing and avoiding it entirely. The texture was slippery and cold, and the flavor was more savory than most people expected from a gelatin dish. Tomato aspic disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when savory gelatin fell completely out of favor. Younger generations found the idea of tomato-flavored jello unappetizing, and the ring mold presentation, once elegant, felt outdated and strange. The dish was remembered as one of the most polarizing church potluck recipes, beloved by grandmothers and rejected by everyone else. It survived in Southern Junior League cookbooks, but was rarely made after the 1970s, and when it did appear, it was treated as a curiosity rather than a serious side dish. But if tomato aspic felt too strange, what came next was richer, nuttier, and rolled into a ball. The cheese ball was a church potluck showpiece throughout the 1960s, brought on a decorative platter and surrounded by crackers. The recipe was simple: cream cheese softened and mixed with shredded cheddar cheese, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes dried beef or green onions, then shaped into a ball and rolled in chopped pecans and dried parsley. The result was rich, savory, tangy, and impressive-looking, a centerpiece appetizer that required no cooking. It cost under $3 to make a large cheese ball that served 30 people, and it could be made the night before and refrigerated until the potluck. The pecans added crunch, the parsley added color, and the cream cheese base was soft enough to spread on crackers, but firm enough to hold its shape. Cheese balls were served at church suppers, holiday gatherings, and ladies' luncheons, and they were always placed near the front of the serving line. The cheese ball disappeared from church potlucks when lighter, fresher appetizers became popular, and the cream cheese cheddar combination felt too heavy. Younger generations preferred hummus, spinach dip, or cheese platters with grapes and crackers, and the pecan parsley coating looked outdated. The cheese ball became a punchline for retro party food, and when it did appear at modern gatherings, it was served ironically. The recipe survived in community cookbooks, but was rarely taken seriously after the 1980s. But if cheese balls felt too rich, what came next was lighter, warmer, and baked with potato chips on top. Hot chicken salad casserole was a 1960s church potluck favorite, especially at ladies' luncheons and funeral meals. The dish was made with cooked chicken diced into bite-sized pieces, mixed with mayonnaise, cream of chicken soup, diced celery, slivered almonds, and sometimes a squeeze of lemon juice, then topped with crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs and baked until golden and bubbling. The result was creamy, crunchy, savory, and warm, a cross between a casserole and a salad. It was affordable, around $3 to make a dish that fed 15 people, and it traveled well in foil pans. Hot chicken salad was served at church suppers, bridal showers, and after church luncheons, and it was always one of the first dishes to empty because it tasted rich and indulgent without requiring expensive ingredients. The almonds added crunch, the celery added freshness, and the potato chip topping stayed crisp even after sitting on a warming table. The casserole disappeared from church potlucks when mayonnaise-based hot dishes fell out of favor, and younger generations preferred lighter, less creamy chicken dishes. The combination of mayo and cream soup felt too heavy, and the potato chip topping seemed outdated. The dish was replaced by grilled chicken salads, cold chicken pasta salads, and roasted chicken breasts. Hot chicken salad casserole survived in vintage Junior League cookbooks, but was rarely made after the 1980s. But if hot chicken salad felt too creamy, what came next was Tangier, Stranger, and Pickled in a jar. Pickled beet eggs were a Pennsylvania Dutch church potluck tradition that spread through 1960s fellowship halls, especially in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states. The recipe was simple. Hard-boiled eggs peeled and placed in a jar with canned pickled beets and their juice, sometimes with added vinegar, sugar, and spices, then refrigerated for at least 3 days until the eggs turned deep magenta and absorbed the tangy, sweet beet flavor. They were inexpensive. A dozen eggs and a can of pickled beets cost under $1, and they could be made a week in advance. Pickled beet eggs were served cold, sliced in half to show the pink and white interior, and arranged on a platter at church potlucks and picnics. The flavor was tangy, earthy, and slightly sweet, and the texture was firm and rubbery from the pickling process. Children were fascinated by the bright pink color, but many refused to eat them. Pickled beet eggs disappeared from church potlucks when regional dishes fell out of favor, and younger generations found the beet-pickled flavor too strong. The Pennsylvania Dutch tradition faded outside of specific communities, and the eggs were replaced by plain deviled eggs or egg salad. The dish survived in Amish and Mennonite communities, but was rarely seen at mainstream church potlucks after the 1970s. When they did appear, they were treated as a novelty rather than a serious side dish. But if pickled beet eggs felt too strange, what came next was simpler, kid-friendly, and wrapped in crescent roll dough. Pigs in a blanket were a church potluck favorite for children's events, youth group gatherings, and Wednesday night suppers throughout the 1960s. The recipe was simple. Hot dogs, often cut into thirds, wrapped in crescent roll dough, baked until the dough turned golden and flaky, then served warm with mustard or ketchup on the side. The result was soft, buttery, salty, and easy to eat. A finger food that required no plates or utensils. It was cheap. A package of hot dogs cost around 50 cents in the 1960s, and a tube of crescent roll dough added another 50 cents, and it could feed 30 people if the hot dogs were cut small. Pigs in a blanket were brought on platters covered with foil, and they were always the first dish to disappear at potlucks because children loved them and adults found them nostalgic. The crescent roll dough was buttery and flaky, and the hot dogs stayed juicy inside. Pigs in a blanket faded from church potlucks when healthier, fresher options became preferred, and crescent roll dough fell out of favor. Younger generations saw them as too processed and too childish for adult gatherings, and the dish was replaced by sliders, chicken tenders, or vegetable trays. Pigs in a blanket survived at children's birthday parties and Super Bowl gatherings, but were rarely seen at church suppers after the 1980s. But if pigs in a blanket felt too simple, what came next was richer, meatier, and spread on crackers. The first 20 dishes were church potluck classics: casseroles, salads, sloppy joes, cheese balls, and pigs in a blanket. But the next 10 go into controversial territory: Liver pate, creamed chipped beef, salmon loaf, lima bean casserole, perfection salad, and dishes so divisive they were banned from some fellowship halls entirely. Liver pate was one of the most controversial dishes at 1960s church potlucks, brought by a select group of women who considered it sophisticated and European-inspired. The recipe varied, but the most common version involved chicken livers sautéed in butter with onions and garlic, then blended or mashed smooth with cream cheese. The mixture was packed into a small bowl or mold, chilled overnight, and served cold with crackers or toast points arranged around it on a platter. Liver pate cost around $2 to make. Chicken livers were cheap, often under 50 cents a pound, but it looked expensive and elegant. The texture was smooth, creamy, and rich, with a deep, earthy flavor that some people loved and others found overwhelming. The brandy or sherry added a subtle sweetness and cut through the richness of the liver, and the cream cheese made it spreadable and mild enough for those unaccustomed to organ meat. At church potlucks, liver pate was divisive. Older women who had grown up eating liver appreciated the dish and saw it as a mark of culinary skill. Younger attendees and children avoided it entirely, calling it the brown stuff and refusing to try it. Men sometimes tried it out of curiosity or politeness, and reactions ranged from enthusiastic approval to polite rejection. The dish was often one of the last to be touched on the serving table, and leftover pate was quietly taken home by the woman who brought it. Liver pate disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s and 1980s when organ meats fell completely out of favor in American home cooking. Younger generations found the idea of liver unappetizing, and the word pate sounded too fancy for a fellowship hall. The dish was replaced by cheese balls, spinach dip, and other cream cheese-based spreads that didn't involve organ meat. Liver pate survived in French restaurants and gourmet delis, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a curiosity, a relic of a time when church potlucks included dishes that required an acquired taste and a willingness to eat foods that modern Americans had abandoned. But if liver pate felt too rich, what came next was saltier, cheaper, and served on toast with a military nickname. Creamed chipped beef on toast, better known by its military nickname SOS, which stood for a phrase too crude for church bulletins, was a polarizing dish at 1960s church potlucks. It was brought by women whose husbands had served in World War II or Korea, and it carried with it a sense of nostalgia, thrift, and wartime survival. The recipe was simple: dried chipped beef, sold in glass jars, rinsed to remove excess salt, torn into pieces, then simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk until thick and creamy. The mixture was served hot over toasted white bread, and the result was salty, creamy, beige, and filling. Chipped beef cost under $1 for a jar that could make enough to feed 15 people, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. The dish was easy to transport in a covered pot or casserole dish, and it reheated well in the church kitchen. Women who brought it to potlucks did so with a mixture of pride and defensiveness. They knew the dish had a reputation, but they also knew it was practical, cheap, and deeply tied to a generation that had lived through rationing and wartime scarcity. At church potlucks, creamed chipped beef was either loved or avoided entirely. Veterans and their wives ate it without hesitation, swapping stories about mess hall meals and wartime cooking. Younger attendees found the name off-putting and the appearance unappetizing. The beige sauce and torn beef didn't photograph well or look elegant on a buffet table. Children refused it outright, calling it gross and gravitating toward fried chicken and sheetcake instead. The dish was often placed toward the back of the serving line, and it was one of the last to be finished. Creamed chipped beef disappeared from church potlucks in the 1980s when the World War II generation aged out of active church participation and younger cooks refused to carry the recipe forward. The dried, chipped beef itself became harder to find in grocery stores, and the military associations felt outdated. The dish was replaced by lighter, less salty options like grilled chicken or baked ham. Creamed chipped beef survived in veterans' halls and military reunions, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1980s. When it did appear, it was served with a knowing smile and a story about the old days. But if creamed chipped beef felt too salty, what came next was fishier, firmer, and covered in white sauce. Salmon loaf was a budget-friendly church potluck dish throughout the 1960s, brought in loaf pans and served in thick slices with a side of white sauce. The recipe was simple. Canned pink salmon drained and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, finely diced onion, a little lemon juice, salt, and pepper, then packed into a loaf pan and baked until firm and golden on top. The loaf was sliced like meatloaf and served warm or at room temperature, often with a white sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and sometimes a squeeze of lemon or a pinch of dill. Canned salmon was affordable, around 75 cents for a large can in the 1960s, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples. A single loaf could feed 12 people, making it an economical choice for church suppers and potlucks. The texture was firm and slightly dry, with flakes of salmon throughout, and small, soft bones that were edible but sometimes surprising. The flavor was mild, fishy, and savory, and the white sauce added creaminess and moisture. At church potlucks, salmon loaf was hit or miss. Older women who had grown up during the Depression appreciated the dish as a practical way to stretch protein, and they often brought it to Wednesday night suppers and funeral luncheons. Younger attendees and children were skeptical. The word loaf didn't sound appetizing, and the pale pink color and visible bones made it less appealing than fried chicken or ham. The dish was often placed in the middle of the serving line, and it was either finished quickly or left mostly untouched, depending on the crowd. Salmon loaf disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s and 1980s when fresh fish became more affordable and canned salmon lost its status as a practical protein. Younger generations preferred grilled salmon fillets, baked fish or shrimp dishes, and the loaf format felt outdated. The white sauce, once a sign of effort and elegance, was replaced by lemon butter or herb sauces. Salmon loaf survived in vintage community cookbooks and was occasionally served at nostalgic gatherings, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1980s. When it did appear, it was treated as a relic of thrift cooking, a reminder of a time when canned fish and breadcrumbs were stretched into a respectable main dish. But if salmon loaf felt too fishy, what came next was softer, milder, and covered in cheese sauce. Lima bean casserole was one of the most divisive dishes at 1960s church potlucks, loved by some and avoided by many. The recipe was straightforward: frozen or canned lima beans drained and layered in a casserole dish, covered with a cheese sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and shredded cheddar cheese, sometimes topped with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, then baked until bubbly and golden. The result was soft, creamy, cheesy, and polarizing. Lima beans had a texture and flavor that people either embraced or rejected outright. Lima beans were cheap. A bag of frozen lima beans cost around 50 cents in the 1960s, and the cheese sauce was made from pantry staples. A single casserole could feed 15 people, making it an economical choice for church suppers. The beans were pale green, soft and slightly starchy, with a mild, almost buttery flavor when cooked properly. The cheese sauce added richness and saltiness, and the breadcrumb topping provided texture and crunch. At church potlucks, Lima bean casserole was controversial. Older women who had grown up eating lima beans saw the dish as practical and wholesome, and they brought it to potlucks without hesitation. Younger attendees and children despised lima beans, calling them mushy and gross, and they avoided the casserole entirely. The dish was often placed toward the back of the serving line, and it was one of the least popular items on the table. Women who brought lima bean casserole learned to expect leftovers and often took most of the dish home at the end of the evening. Lima bean casserole disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s and 1980s when lima beans fell almost entirely out of favor in American home cooking. Younger generations associated them with school cafeterias and institutional food, and the soft, starchy texture was seen as unappetizing. The dish was replaced by green bean casserole, broccoli casserole, and other vegetable dishes with more universal appeal. Lima bean casserole survived in a few Southern community cookbooks and was occasionally served at nostalgic gatherings, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a joke, symbol of the most unloved church potluck dishes of the past. But if Lima bean casserole felt too soft, what came next was firmer, stranger, and made entirely from gelatin and cabbage. Perfection salad was the ultimate 1960s church potluck oddity. A savory gelatin salad made with lemon or lime jello, finely shredded cabbage, diced celery, grated carrots, and sometimes pimentos or green peppers, all suspended in a wobbly, translucent mold and served cold on a platter. The recipe had been popular since the early 1900s, and by the 1960s it was a staple at church suppers, ladies' luncheons, and holiday gatherings. The dish was named Perfection because it was considered the ideal gelatin salad, balanced, colorful, and elegant. It was inexpensive, under $2 to make a large mold that served 20 people, and it could be made the day before and refrigerated until the potluck. The gelatin was tangy and sweet. The cabbage was crunchy and slightly bitter, and the celery and carrots added texture and color. The dish was served in slices or scoops, and it was often accompanied by a dollop of mayonnaise or a sprinkle of paprika. At church potlucks, perfection salad was divisive. Older women who had grown up with gelatin salads saw the dish as refined and proper, a sign of effort and attention to detail. Younger attendees found it baffling. The combination of jello and cabbage seemed wrong, and the wobbly texture was off-putting. Children avoided it entirely, calling it the vegetable jello and refusing to try it. The dish was often one of the last to be touched on the serving table, and leftover perfection salad was quietly taken home by the woman who brought it. Perfection salad disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when savory gelatin salads fell completely out of favor. Younger generations rejected the idea of vegetables suspended in sweetened gelatin, and the dish became a punchline for outdated church food. The name Perfection felt ironic, and the recipe was replaced by tossed green salads, coleslaw, and other fresh vegetable dishes. Perfection salad survived in vintage cookbooks and was occasionally served at nostalgic or ironic gatherings, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a curiosity, a reminder of a time when gelatin was considered an elegant base for nearly any ingredient, no matter how strange the combination seemed to modern eaters. But if perfection salad felt too strange, what came next was meatier, stranger, and brought in a jar. The first 25 dishes tested patience and taste: liver pate, creamed chipped beef, salmon loaf, lima beans, and perfection salad. But the final 5 go into territory most churches banned outright: pickled pig's feet, head cheese, tongue sandwiches, kidney bean salad, and Braunschweiger spread. These weren't just forgotten, they were rejected. Pickled pig's feet were the most controversial dish ever brought to a 1960s church potluck, and in most fellowship halls, they were quietly discouraged or outright banned. The dish was simple in preparation, but shocking in presentation. Pig's feet cleaned, boiled until tender, then packed into jars with vinegar, salt, pickling spices, onions, and sometimes hot peppers, then refrigerated for at least a week until the meat absorbed the brine and turned tangy, salty, and tender. The feet were served cold, pulled directly from the jar, and eaten with fingers or a fork, and the appearance, pale, gelatinous, with visible bones and skin, made them immediately recognizable and polarizing. Pickled pig's feet were cheap. Pig's feet cost pennies per pound in the 1960s, and the pickling ingredients were pantry staples. They were a niche taste. The texture was gelatinous, chewy and fatty, soft skin and tender meat that fell off the bone. The flavor was intensely salty, vinegary, and rich, and the dish was beloved by people who had grown up eating it in southern Appalachian or immigrant communities. It was seen as a delicacy by some and as unappetizing by many. At church potlucks, pickled pig's feet were met with a range of reactions. A few older men and women ate them enthusiastically, praising the flavor and reminiscing about growing up with pickled meats. Most attendees avoided the dish entirely, unwilling to try something that looked so unfamiliar and unappetizing. Children were horrified by the appearance and the name, and the dish became a source of jokes and whispered comments. Women who brought pickled pig's feet to church potlucks learned quickly that the dish was not universally appreciated, and many stopped bringing it after 1 or 2 attempts. Pickled pig's feet disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when organ meats and offal fell out of favor, and younger generations rejected traditional preservation techniques. The dish was replaced by more universally acceptable appetizers like cheese balls, deviled eggs, and vegetable trays. Pickled pig's feet survived in specialty stores, ethnic markets, and a few rural communities, but they were rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When they did appear, it was as a deliberate provocation or a nostalgic nod to a vanished era of church potluck food, a reminder that not every dish from the past deserved to be revived. But if pickled pig's feet felt too extreme, what came next was milder, but still made from parts most people refused to name. Head cheese was another controversial church potluck dish from the 1960s, brought by a small group of women and men who had grown up in communities where no part of the animal was wasted. Despite its name, head cheese contained no cheese. It was a type of cold cut made from the head of a pig, sometimes a calf, simmered for hours until the meat was tender and the natural gelatin from the bones and skin thickened the cooking liquid. The meat was pulled from the bones, chopped or shredded, mixed with the gelatinous broth, seasoned with salt, pepper, vinegar, and sometimes garlic or spices, then poured into a loaf pan or mold and chilled until firm. The result was sliced thin and served cold on crackers or bread. Head cheese was inexpensive. Pig heads were nearly free or sold for pennies in the 1960s. The preparation was labor-intensive and required knowledge of butchering and preservation. The texture was gelatinous, firm, and slightly chewy, with bits of tender meat, fat, and sometimes gristle suspended in the translucent jelly. Flavor was rich, savory, and slightly tangy, and the appearance, pale, mottled, with visible chunks of meat, was off-putting to those unfamiliar with the dish. At church potlucks, head cheese was met with skepticism and outright rejection. A few older attendees, particularly those from German, Polish, or Southern backgrounds, ate it with enthusiasm and praised its flavor and resourcefulness. Most people avoided it entirely, unwilling to try something that looked so unfamiliar and was made from parts of the animal they preferred not to think about. The name head cheese didn't help. It confused people and made the dish sound even less appealing. Children were horrified, and the dish was often one of the first to be removed from the serving table, not because it was eaten, but because it made other attendees uncomfortable. Head cheese disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when offal and organ meats fell almost entirely out of favor in mainstream American cooking. Younger generations found the idea of eating meat from an animal's head unappetizing, and the dish was replaced by deli meats, cheese trays, and sandwich platters. Head cheese survived in ethnic delis, specialty butcher shops, and a few rural communities, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a relic of extreme thrift and old-world traditions, dish that reminded people of a time when wasting food was unthinkable, even if modern tastes had moved on. But if head cheese felt too strange, what came next was simpler but no less controversial. An organ meat sliced thin and served on white bread. The slices were served cold on white bread with mustard, sometimes with a little mayonnaise or pickles, and the sandwiches were arranged on a platter and covered with plastic wrap. Tongue was affordable. A whole beef tongue cost around $2 in the 1960s, and it yielded enough meat to make sandwiches for 30 people. At church potlucks, tongue sandwiches were met with strong reactions. A few older men and women, particularly those from Jewish, German, or Eastern European backgrounds, ate them with enthusiasm and praised the flavor and tenderness. Most attendees avoided the sandwiches entirely, unwilling to eat an organ meat that reminded them too much of its origin. The name tongue was a barrier. It was too descriptive, too literal, and it made people uncomfortable. Children refused to try the sandwiches, and the dish was often one of the last to be touched on the serving table. Tongue sandwiches disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when organ meats fell out of favor, and younger generations rejected traditional dishes made from animal parts they found unappetizing. The dish was replaced by turkey, ham, and roast beef sandwiches made from more familiar cuts of meat. Tongue survived in Jewish delis, ethnic butcher shops, and a few immigrant communities, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a curiosity. But if tongue sandwiches felt too literal, what came next was simpler, milder, and made from beans and vinegar. Kidney bean and onion salad was a budget-friendly church potluck dish throughout the 1960s, brought in glass bowls and served cold as a side dish. The recipe was simple: canned kidney beans, drained and rinsed, mixed with thinly sliced raw onions, and a dressing made from vinegar, oil, sugar, salt, and pepper, then chilled for several hours or overnight so the flavors could meld. The result was tangy, crunchy, slightly sweet, and filling, a salad that cost under $1 to make and could feed 20 people. Kidney beans were cheap and shelf-stable, and the dressing ingredients were pantry staples. The salad was easy to transport and required no cooking, making it a practical choice for church suppers and potlucks. The texture was firm and slightly mealy from the beans, with a sharp crunch from the raw onions. The vinegar dressing was tangy and sweet, and the oil gave the salad a slight richness. The dish was served cold, often alongside fried chicken, ham, or casseroles. At church potlucks, kidney bean salad was divisive. Older women who had grown up during the Depression appreciated the dish as a practical, protein-rich side that stretched a budget. Younger attendees found the combination of raw onions and canned beans unappealing, and the vinegar dressing was too sharp for modern tastes. Children avoided the salad entirely, calling it the bean thing, and gravitating toward sweeter, creamier salads like ambrosia or macaroni salad. The dish was often placed toward the back of the serving line, and it was one of the last to be finished. Kidney bean salad disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s and 1980s when three-bean salad, a milder, more colorful version with green beans and wax beans, became more popular. Younger generations preferred salads with less vinegar and more variety, and the raw onions were seen as too strong. The dish was replaced by pasta salads, grain salads, and fresher vegetable-based sides. Kidney bean salad survived in a few vintage community cookbooks and was occasionally served at nostalgic gatherings, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1980s. But if kidney bean salad felt too plain, what came next was richer, meatier, and spread on rye bread in thick brown slices. Braunschweiger spread was the final controversial dish at 1960s church potlucks, brought by a small group of women with German or Central European heritage who considered the dish a delicacy. Braunschweiger is a type of liverwurst, a soft, spreadable sausage made from pork liver, pork, spices, and sometimes onions, and in the 1960s it was sold in tubes or chubs at the grocery store for under $1. The spread was made by mashing Braunschweiger with softened cream cheese, a little mayonnaise, finely diced onion, and sometimes a splash of Worcestershire sauce, then served cold on rye bread or crackers. The spread was rich, smooth, and intensely savory, with a deep liver flavor that some people loved and many others found overwhelming. The cream cheese and mayonnaise softened the intensity and made the spread lighter and more spreadable, and the onion added sharpness and crunch. The rye bread provided a sturdy, slightly sour base that complemented the rich spread. The dish was inexpensive. Braunschweiger cost around 75 cents in the 1960s, and the rest of the ingredients were pantry staples, and a single tube could make enough spread for 30 sandwiches. Women who brought Braunschweiger spread to church potlucks did so with pride, arranging the rye bread slices neatly on a platter and sometimes garnishing the spread with a sprinkle of paprika or a few thin onion rings. The dish was practical. It required no cooking, could be made the night before, and transported easily in covered containers. It was also culturally significant, a way to share heritage and tradition with the congregation, and a reminder of old-world recipes that had been passed down through generations. At church potlucks, Braunschweiger spread was met with strong reactions. A few older men and women, particularly those from German or Polish backgrounds, ate it enthusiastically and praised its rich flavor and old-world authenticity. They spoke fondly of growing up with liverwurst, of sandwiches packed in lunch pails, and of the way the spread reminded them of their grandmother's kitchens. Most attendees avoided it entirely, unwilling to try a liver-based spread that looked brown and unappetizing. The name Braunschweiger was difficult to pronounce and unfamiliar to many, and the word liverwurst made people uncomfortable. Children refused to try it, and the dish was often one of the last to be touched on the serving table. Braunschweiger spread disappeared from church potlucks in the 1970s when liver and organ meats fell almost entirely out of favor in American home cooking. Younger generations found the idea of liver sausage unappetizing, and the dish was replaced by cheese balls, spinach dip, and other cream cheese-based spreads that didn't involve organ meat. Braunschweiger survived in German delis and specialty stores, but it was rarely seen at church suppers after the 1970s. When it did appear, it was treated as a relic of ethnic church potluck food, a reminder of a time when fellowship halls welcomed dishes from immigrant traditions, even if those dishes made some people uncomfortable and were never quite mainstream. These 30 dishes weren't just recipes, they were the backbone of 1960s church fellowship. They were carried into basement halls in Pyrex dishes and Tupperware containers, laid out on folding tables covered with paper tablecloths, and served on paper plates with plastic forks. They were made by grandmothers who knew how to stretch $1, feed a crowd, and turn pantry staples into something that looked impressive and tasted like home. They were green bean casserole, jello salads, deviled eggs, tuna casseroles, fried chicken, funeral potatoes, and sheetcakes that disappeared before the blessing was finished. But they were also the controversial dishes, the ones that tested patience and taste: liver pate on crackers, creamed chipped beef that carried a military nickname, salmon loaf with white sauce, lima bean casseroles that children refused to touch, perfection salad with cabbage suspended in gelatin. Which of these 30 church potluck dishes shocked you most or reminded you of your grandmother's fellowship hall? Subscribe to preserve the history of church potluck food that nobody serves anymore.